Snow fell in patient silence that morning, soft as ash and pale as breath. Hollow Bend still slept under its white blanket when Clara May Harlow stepped out of her cabin, a small figure wrapped in a threadbare red shawl that once belonged to her mother. The hem fluttered like a tired flame against the wind. The pail in her hand clanked lightly, a sound that seemed too fragile for the frozen world around her. She paused on the stoop, squinting at the horizon where dawn had not yet gathered the courage to rise. Smoke curled weakly from a few chimneys across the valley. The church bell would not ring for another hour, and the horses in the stable stood motionless, their backs crowned with frost. All that stirred was the wind and the little girl walking toward the well. Inside the cabin, her mother lay beneath quilts that smelled of lavender and sickness. The fever had not left for weeks. Clara had pressed a damp cloth to her forehead before leaving, whispering the same promise she whispered every morning. "I'll bring water before the fire goes out." Her mother had smiled faintly, lips dry and trembling, as though the words themselves were enough to keep her alive a little longer. Clara's boots crunched through the crusted snow. The air stung her face, but she liked the sting. It meant she was still strong enough to feel it. Each breath made a small cloud before her, vanishing just as quickly. She walked past shuttered homes and sleeping windows, past the chapel cross half buried in snowdrift, and down the narrow path that led to the frozen creek bed where the old stone well waited. The rope was stiff with ice when she reached it. She wrapped her mittened hands around it, tugged, and heard the groan of frozen wood. Her breath came in small gasps as she wound the rope around the post, lowering the bucket carefully into the darkness. The sound of it striking water was faint, like a coin dropping into eternity. She smiled despite her numb fingers. Behind her, a horse snorted. Clara turned. A stranger sat atop a black gelding, his hat rimed with frost, his coat dusted white as the hills behind him. He watched her for a long moment before dismounting. She froze, unsure whether to run or curtsy or speak, but the man only nodded and stepped toward the well. "You're early to the water, little one," he said, voice low and steady. "Mama needs it warm before the fire dies," she answered. He studied her hands as she struggled with the crank. Without a word, he reached out and steadied the handle, his gloved fingers moving with a calm precision that spoke of experience. Together they pulled. The bucket rose, full and heavy. Clara's eyes darted up at him, surprised by the quiet kindness. "You from town?" she asked. "Just passing through," he said. "Name's Rowan Creed," she nodded politely. "Clara May Harlow," he smiled faintly. "Well, Miss Harlow, that's a fine bit of work you've done here." She took the bucket carefully, its rim slick with frost. "Mama says work keeps the cold away." He looked at her a moment longer, something flickering behind his eyes, recognition, maybe, or memory, but said nothing more. When he offered her a coin for her trouble, she shook her head. "Mama says we don't take what we didn't earn." "Smart woman," he said, pocketing the coin. Then, tipping his hat, he mounted up and rode toward the main road, his figure fading into the falling snow. By the time Clara returned home, her arms trembled under the bucket's weight. She nudged the door open with her boot, warmth wrapping around her like an old friend. The cabin smelled of pine sap and candle smoke. Her mother stirred faintly when Clara poured water into the kettle. "Did you see anyone?" Evelyn asked, her voice thin as paper. "Just a man on a horse," Clara replied. "He helped with the well." Her mother smiled faintly. "There are still good souls left, then." Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Most folks in Hollow Bend didn't stop to speak anymore. They'd looked the other way when her father died in the mine collapse last spring, and they still crossed the street when they saw her mother's shuttered window. Pity had a short memory in Hollow Bend. When Clara went to the general store later that week, whispers followed her like shadows. "That Harlow girl fetching water alone again," someone muttered. "Her mama's barely hanging on. Poor child'll freeze one of these days." Clara kept her eyes on her boots, heart heavy but face steady. She bought what little she could, flour, salt, a stub of soap, and hurried home through the cold. That night, when she opened the door, she found a loaf of bread on the stoop, fresh, still warm inside its crust. No note, just mercy. She glanced around the empty street but saw no one. A quiet smile touched her lips before she brought it inside. Her mother blessed it with shaking hands before breaking it in half. "You see, Clara," she said softly, "kindness doesn't always knock." The next morning, Clara met Rowan again at the well. The wind was sharper, cutting through the valley like glass. He was already there, filling his own pail, his horse stamping the ground impatiently. "You again," he said with a small grin. Clara shrugged. "The well don't fill itself." He chuckled quietly and held out his gloves. Try warming your hands before you crank. Makes it easier. She hesitated, then placed her small palms between his hands. They were rough and calloused, but warm as firewood. She looked up at him, startled by the sudden softness in his eyes. For a brief second, time felt still, like the world had stopped breathing to let them catch theirs. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling back. He nodded, stepping aside. "You remind me of someone," he said after a while. "My boy used to fetch water for his ma. Kept saying it was his way of being a man. Where is he now?" Rowan's eyes lowered. "Gone a long time." The wind filled the silence between them. Clara didn't ask more. Children understood grief without needing its details. As days passed, the rhythm of the well became their language. He would arrive early, help her draw water, share a few words, then leave before town could notice. She began to hum while she worked. Old hymns her mother once sang when the nights were too long. Rowan listened quietly, the corner of his mouth lifting each time. "You sound like spring trying to remember itself," he said once. She blushed. "Spring's far away," he smiled. "Maybe. But it's coming." The world around them, though, did not soften. Snow deepened. The wind screamed louder at night. Clara's mother grew paler, her fever painting roses on her cheeks that did not fade. Sometimes Clara sat beside her bed and read from the worn Bible, tracing the letters with her finger because her eyes blurred from fatigue. When the church bell rang one Sunday, Clara wanted to go, but she couldn't leave her mother alone. Through the window she saw the townsfolk in their heavy coats, laughter trailing behind them like smoke. They passed their house without a glance. She turned away, pressing her forehead to the glass until her breath fogged it. That afternoon, Rowan knocked gently on the door. When she opened it, he stood there holding a small sack. "Got you some coal," he said. "It'll burn longer than wood." Clara looked up at him with wide eyes. "We can't pay." He knelt so they were level. "Then promise me you'll stay warm. That'll be enough." Her mother called weakly from the bed. "Let him in, Clara." Inside, Rowan set the coal near the hearth and tipped his hat to Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said softly. "You have a kind heart, Mr. Creed," she replied. "Not many would stop for us." "I know what it's like to lose light," he said, voice low. For a while, the three of them shared quiet company, the fire crackling, the wind sighing outside. Clara poured tea, her small hands steady despite the weight of gratitude she couldn't name. When Rowan rose to leave, Evelyn whispered, "May God keep you in his watch." He paused at the door. "He already sent me here, ma'am." That night, after he left, Clara watched the snow drift past the window. She felt something new blooming beneath the ache in her chest. Hope, maybe, or faith in the small mercies of strangers. She thought of Rowan's eyes when he smiled, the tired kindness there, and she wondered what sorrow a man carried to make him so gentle. The next morning, she woke before dawn again. The wind was sharper still, clawing at the shutters. Her mother was sleeping, her breath shallow but steady. Clara wrapped herself in the red shawl and stepped into the snow. The world was ghost white, the air filled with the whisper of an oncoming storm. The well stood waiting, a dark mouth in the distance. She tightened her grip on the pail and started walking, boots crunching through the frost. Somewhere beyond the hills she thought she heard a horse's whinny, faint but familiar. She smiled to herself and kept walking, unaware that the sky above her was already thickening to gray. The day felt colder than all before, though she didn't yet know why. She only knew that each step carried her closer to something unseen, but certain as the ache in her chest. And somewhere on the far ridge, Rowan Creed tightened his saddle straps and looked toward the valley, sensing that the winter's hardest trial had not yet come. The wind picked up. Snow began to fall again, heavy and endless. Clara's red shawl flashed once against the white before the storm swallowed her whole. By dawn, the sky had turned to pewter, and the valley lay buried beneath a silence that made the earth feel hollow. The snow came down in thick, swirling sheets, so dense it erased the line between sky and ground. Rowan Creed stood by the stable door, his breath clouding before him, a heaviness gnawing at the edges of his chest. He'd been dreaming again, of his boy calling his name from a blizzard much like this one, a cry swallowed by wind. The echo still rang in his bones. He rubbed a hand over his face and stepped outside. The snow reached his boots in minutes, soaking through to his socks. From the ridge he could barely see the town's edge, just smoke faint as thread rising from a few chimneys. Then, far beyond the last fence line, a tiny flicker of color, red against the gray. He blinked hard, thinking the storm played tricks on him, but it moved. Slow, struggling. A child's shape. God above, he muttered. He threw the saddle on his horse and kicked the gate open. The animal balked at the cold, nostrils flaring. But Rowan pressed it forward, jaw set, eyes squinting through the curtain of snow. The wind clawed at his coat and stung his face raw. He could barely breathe, but he rode harder, heart pounding like hooves in his chest. When he reached the well, the girl was there, half kneeling, one mitten gone, her pail toppled over. The rope hung snapped beside her, frayed and frozen. Her shawl whipped in the wind, red against the white, a desperate flag. She was crying, soundless beneath the roar of the storm. "Clara!" he shouted, though she might not have heard. He leapt down, boots sinking deep. She looked up then, dazed, her face white as the snow itself. "I dropped the bucket," she whispered, voice thin as a reed. He knelt and caught her trembling shoulders. "Forget the bucket. You'll freeze out here." "I have to bring water," she murmured. "Mama needs it." Her lips were blue, eyes glassy. Rowan felt something inside him twist and break. "Your mother needs you alive more than she needs water." He wrapped her in his coat, lifting her easily, though she was stiff with cold. The storm howled louder, mocking his every step. He turned his back to the wind and started toward the cabin, holding her close. Each breath was pain, each movement a fight, but he kept going, whispering to her as he went. "Stay awake, little one. Don't you close those eyes on me." The door of the Harlow cabin burst open under his shoulder. Warmth hit him like a blessing. He laid her on the bed beside her mother, whose eyes flew open in shock. Evelyn tried to rise, but her body gave out halfway, a weak sound escaping her throat. She was out in that storm, Rowan said, kneeling by the hearth, already feeding kindling to the flames. His hands shook, not from the cold, but from the memory of another fire he had once built too late. Evelyn's fingers brushed her daughter's cheek. "Clara, my love." The child stirred faintly. "Mama, the well rope broke." "You hush now," Rowan said, voice soft but fierce. "You did enough for 10 men this morning." The kettle sat cold beside the hearth. He poured what little water remained into a tin cup and held it near the flame, watching steam rise in slow curls. Evelyn's breath rasped beside him. When he turned, she was studying him, not with fear, but with recognition. "I know your face," she whispered. "Rowan Creed, you worked the northern range. Lost a family in the blizzard some winters back." He froze, cup halfway to her lips. He hadn't heard his name spoken like that in years. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally. "I remember," she murmured. "You were kind even then." "I wasn't kind enough," he replied, his voice breaking on the last word. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade. Evelyn's gaze softened, her eyes bright with something gentler than pity. "You're here now?" she said. "That's enough kindness for one lifetime." He bowed his head, unable to speak. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Clara's breathing steadied, her small hand curling around her mother's. Rowan stayed by the fire until the color returned to her cheeks, until the frost melted from her hair. That night, the storm raged with fury, shaking the cabin walls. Rowan sat awake while the two of them slept, staring into the flames as if he might read his salvation there. Each gust of wind sounded like the voices he'd lost, his wife's laughter, his boy's cry fading in the snow. But when Clara stirred and murmured his name, it was the first time in years that he felt the world forgive him. By morning, the storm had quieted. The valley was unrecognizable, a white desert under a sky bruised by dawn. He stepped outside to gather more wood, the air brittle and bright. When he returned, Evelyn was awake, but her skin had taken on the stillness of someone preparing to leave. She looked at him with a strange peace. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. When I'm gone, see that Clara don't grow up thinking kindness is a debt to repay. Let her believe it's the air we breathe." He nodded slowly, throat tight. "You have my word." Her eyes lingered on him a moment longer, as if memorizing the lines of his face. Then she reached for his hand, her fingers light as feathers. "Thank you for coming when you did." Hours later, when Clara woke, her mother's hand was still warm, but her chest no longer moved. The girl's small cry broke the cabin's silence. Rowan turned away, jaw trembling. He wanted to tell her that her mother looked peaceful, that she'd gone like a candle snuffed by mercy, but no words felt right. He dug the grave himself beneath the old oak near the well. The ground was hard as stone, but he didn't stop until the work was done. Clara stood beside him, the red shawl wrapped around her like armor, her cheeks pale but dry. When he finished, she knelt and pressed a small wooden cross into the snow. Rowan set his hat to his chest. "Your mama's resting easy now," he said quietly. "She ain't gone far, just beyond the hill where the morning comes first." The townsfolk gathered slowly, drawn by the sound of shovels and the quiet rumor of death. For once they didn't whisper. No one turned away. When the preacher said the final prayer, even the wind seemed to still. Afterward, the people drifted back to their lives, leaving only the two of them by the grave. Rowan handed her a small piece of carved wood, Evelyn's name etched clumsily with his knife. "I never was much with words," he said, "but I figured she'd want her name to stay here a while." Clara traced the letters with her mittened finger. "Thank you," she whispered. He crouched to meet her eyes. "You got someone to stay with?" She shook her head. "Then you'll come with me," he said simply. "If you'd like." The wind carried away her answer, but when he lifted her onto his horse, she clung to him without fear. Days turned into weeks. The snow softened, dripping from rooftops in silver threads. Rowan found work mending fences on the outskirts of town, and Clara helped where she could, feeding horses, patching his gloves, humming softly as she worked. Together they tended the cabin through the thaw. The silence between them became its own kind of language, gentle and sure. The gossip that once circled like vultures found new stories to chase. Folks began to nod at them when they passed, sometimes even smiling. Children waved. The world somehow had remembered its manners. One evening, when the first hints of spring brushed the valley, Clara sat by the well again. The new rope creaked as she drew water, sunlight glinting off the ripples below. Rowan leaned against the fence, arms folded, watching quietly. "Feels different now," she said. "How so?" "It's not so lonely," he smiled. "That's how you know you're healing." She turned to him, the red shawl bright in the dusk. "Mama used to say the world is kind to those who keep trying to love it. She was a wise woman. She said you'd understand." He swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. "Maybe I do." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. Then Clara lit a candle and placed it by the well. The flame trembled but did not go out. Rowan looked down at her and tipped his hat. "She'd be proud, you know." "I hope so," Clara said, her gaze on the light. "I think she'd like that you stayed." He smiled, the kind that starts small but stays. Some places are worth staying for. As dusk deepened, they stood together. Two souls stitched back into the world by kindness. The candle's glow painted their faces gold against the encroaching blue of evening. Behind them, the oak tree bent gently in the wind, whispering through its branches like a prayer that had finally found its answer. Later that night, as the stars burned cold and clear above the valley, the narrator's voice returns, low and steady, like an ember refusing to die. "Some winters never truly end. They only wait for a hand to light a fire. If you felt the warmth of this tale, stay a while longer. There are more stories yet to tell, more hearts to thaw in the quiet towns of the Wild West."